Hello everyone, my name is Olivia and welcome to my recent reads, which was supposed to be filmed in 2019, but I didn't have the time to film it towards the end of the year, so you're getting it in January 2020. So I'm going to be talking about my 91st read to my 101 from 2019. I hit 101 books. I don't know how that happened. I mostly think audiobooks for being able to read that much, but let's just get right into it. Let's talk about the books that I read towards the end of 2019 to hit over 100 reads for that year. So my 91st read for 2019 was Monster, She Wrote, the woman who pioneered horror and speculative fiction. So it basically shows you throughout history the different women who have written horror books or written speculative fiction novels, and it shows how they used their experiences and their life to influence their novels, or how they just really pioneered and really created different genres of horror and different subsections of horror throughout their storytelling. And it was really interesting because I'm not one to read a lot of horror, so I just wanted to learn more about it because I only really know about Mary Shelley. So I wanted to learn about the other women who have contributed to this very famous genre, and it was really interesting. I feel like if you want to get a lot of horror book recommendations or just learn about the women who have written in this specific genre, this book would be really interesting to read. And it also gives you a bunch of good recommendations. It recommends books that the author has written that they didn't specifically highlight in the book. It also speaks about movies that maybe their book turned into. It was a nice nonfiction, and it was also just beautifully illustrated because it all has this green hue to it, and it was just a very well laid out book that I really appreciated. The next book that I read was Sorcery of Thorns, and I just kind of realized that I really cannot read YA fantasy anymore. I could read a couple of them if it's series that I really enjoy, it's by an author I really enjoy, but just like diving into new YA fantasy, I just like cannot get into it, mostly because I do not enjoy fantasy, so it's very rare for me to be impressed by it. But also I feel like these books are just kind of being recycled and the same storylines and same tropes are being used, and Sorcery of Thorns was just not enjoyable for me. I can't even give you like a synopsis. I think it's a girl who grew up in a library where all these books are like really magical, and she has these magical abilities, and then this like hunter or guy shows up and he whisks her away and they go on a mission. And I don't really remember what else happened because I was listening to it on audiobook and I was just not enjoying it because it was just very tropey and it was just very unoriginal in my opinion. I feel like nothing new was added to this world that was created. I feel like I've read so many YA fantasies that were similar to it, and it was just meh. It was just meh to me. I'm just realizing that YA fantasy and I do not mix well together. Very rarely do we enjoy each other. The next book that I read that I really enjoyed, and I read all on an airplane I believe, was I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver. This is a wonderful YA contemporary about a person named Ben who comes out as non-binary to their parents, and their parents do not take it well, and they kick Ben out of their house, so Ben has to go live with their sister, and they have to go to a new school and just like really go through a bunch of different life changes because they are in their senior year. A lot of changes are coming. They're learning about making new friends and trusting their sister who they haven't spoken to in a bunch of years. And it is such a wonderful, well-written YA that combines so many different aspects of being a teenager, and it combines it into just like a wonderful story that is hard-hitting but also gives you hope and it just fills you with warmth, and I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read is the only one that I have to show you physically for this haul, and it is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. This is a historical fiction novel about a woman named Vivian who gets sent to New York City, and she lives with her aunt in her theater that she owns, and Vivian starts to discover that all these people who work at the theater are all eccentric and weird and very open about their sexuality. So as Vivian grows up and grows older in New York City and she befriends all these people, she begins to explore her own sexuality and her own independence as a 19-year-old in New York City, and eventually she gets into a scandal which rocks her world and it changes her life for the worse, and she has to grow up and learn from her mistakes and just like learn about what it is to be a woman in New York City, because it is a cutthroat world out there, and it's also about finding your passion. It's kind of like Evelyn Hugo, because Vivian is much older now and she is recounting her life to someone in this story, and it's just talking about the good, bad, and the ugly about her life. I promise it's not similar in storyline, so you won't be reading the same exact story, because this has nothing to do with Hollywood, but it was just a very cool story that just explores so many different aspects of what it means to be a woman, especially in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as she grows older, and just like learns from different life lessons and befriends different people and learns lessons through them as well. It was a wonderful story. The next book that I read is The Only Woman in the Room by Marie Benedict, and I gave this book 1 star. This is a historical fiction novel recounting Hedy Lamarr's life, and Hedy Lamarr is not only a wonderful actress in old Hollywood, but she was also an inventor who created the basis for GPS, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and so many different things. And I feel like this story was not what it could have been. It was a very bare bones story about Hedy Lamarr's life. I feel like it did not do justice to her at all, because it mostly focused around her first husband that she had, and it mostly focused around their relationship. And this story could have really focused on the strife that Hedy Lamarr went through as an actress and as a celebrity, as she is trying to get her inventions patented and get used to help stop and put an end to World War II quicker than it could have been. Because most of Hedy Lamarr's life, she is being ignored simply because people see her as just a pretty face. They don't think she has any substance or any intelligence to her. And I feel like that's something that could be explored exponentially in a story, but it wasn't. It was just brushed over, and I feel like the story could have explored that so much more and had so much more depth to it, but it didn't. And it also fictionalized different parts of Hedy Lamarr's life, and I don't enjoy that, because if you're talking about a real person who has these very big moments in her life and you're fictionalizing it and tweaking it a little, you're not doing justice to the woman that you are writing about, who was a real person. I feel like if you're writing a simple historical fiction, you're making up these characters, you could do whatever you want. But you're writing about Hedy Lamarr, and fictionalizing and changing pieces of her history left a bad taste in my mouth. The next book that I read was The Right Swipe by Alisha Rai. This was such a wonderful romance story. It is about a woman who is in charge of a online dating app, and one day she goes to a conference and realizes that a person that she hooked up with previously is now the spokesperson for her rival dating app. So it's basically them coming back together and realizing they have a bunch of unfinished business that they must speak about, all while Ree is trying to merge with this rival dating app that Samson is now the spokesperson of. It also speaks about how different dating life is now, where people use apps, and it's different trying to meet people now. And it also just speaks about second chance romance. The romance was so wonderful because Samson is such a supportive love interest, and he is just such a sweet person, and it's so refreshing to always see some sweet male love interests in these stories, because they're very few and far in between, and I just really appreciate them every time I come across one. And Alisha Rai just always writes the best romances. Her and Rebecca Weatherspoon are just like the queen of romances in my opinion, and whenever I read one of their books I just get completely sucked in and I just fall in love with their stories and the romance that is in it, and it was just a very enjoyable read. The next book I read was actually in my favorite reads of 2019, and it is Night. Night is a nonfiction, and Elie recounts his life when he was living in a ghetto, and then he was transported to a bunch of different concentration camps with his father, and it shows how they both try and survive together, and it just recounts the horrific actions and horrific moments in Elie's life. And Night is just like a book that I feel like every single person should read. I spoke more about it in my favorite reads of 2019, which I would highly recommend you watch, because I feel like I go more into it, and I'm very glad that I picked it up because I've been recommended it for years and years and years, and I feel like I never had the right mindset to read it. I feel like like I was waiting to get a little bit older so it could impact me a little bit more, because I feel like reading it in high school, I would have liked it. I would have liked the message that it had to send, but I wouldn't have appreciated it as much as I did now as a 22-year-old. The next book I picked up on audiobook, and it is Severance, and I somewhat enjoyed this, but it wasn't my favorite, and I was just like lukewarm about it. It is about a woman who moves to New York City, and she's working this very mundane job in a publishing company. I think she's like working on like selling Bibles, and she is so absorbed with her job that she barely notices that the apocalypse is happening, and it's something called a fever. So once someone has the fever, their body kind of shuts down and they're stuck doing a mundane activity over and over again. So like, let's say you get the fever while you're reading, you'll just keep on reading and flipping through that book until the pages break, until the book falls apart, or until your hands become worn and dry. So I was reading the Goodreads synopsis, and it said that it's like a hilarious satire, and while I understand that because it speaks about how superficial New York City is and how everyone is working so hard in their jobs and they think their jobs are so important, but they're never really able to pay their rent and they're only just surviving, they're not really living. I understand like the satire there, but I didn't think it was hilarious. But it's also because I just have a terrible sense of humor, so like I don't laugh at things a lot, I just don't find a lot of things funny. So it might have just gone right over my head, but I just thought it was an okay book. I didn't think it was hilarious. I didn't think it was very satirical. I just thought it was a very nice commentary about how we are stuck in this like capitalistic society where we're just forced to work and work and work to the point where we might not even notice when the apocalypse begins. My main issue was that the book wasn't in chronological order, so it flip-flopped between the main character working in her job and her post-apocalyptic life when she is working and living with these group of survivors who are kind of weird, and it's kind of like a totalitarian group, and it's just a weird dynamic. And while it flip-flops between those two timelines, I feel like it didn't impact me as much as it would have if it was chronological. If we saw her working her mundane job and we saw her realize the apocalypse is happening, and then she meets up with this group, and then she realizes that this group is very much controlling and wants to limit her. I wish it was in chronological order rather than going back and forth, because I feel like it wasn't as impactful for me. The next book I think I gave 1 star to, and it is Flâneuse, and it is a nonfiction about a woman who lived in a bunch of different cities throughout her life. She lived in Paris, she lived in Tokyo, she lived in New York City, and it talks about the different dynamics of those cities and her different feelings about the cities. And it also talks about how women in society are frowned upon from like walking and taking up space in cities, which I thought was such an interesting concept. I guess to say I thought the thesis statement of this book was very interesting, but the way that it was delivered was boring, because this lady is not recounting her own life. She's also talking about pieces of history and different historical figures that lived in each different city, and I was just not interested. And I also didn't enjoy how this woman lived in Tokyo among the other cities that she lived in, and she was just very critical and very negative towards Japanese culture. I did not enjoy the way that she spoke about Japanese culture while she praised these other white-centric cultures so much higher than Japanese culture. It just was very weird, and once it got to that point, I was like, yeah, this book is getting 1 star. The next book that I read, which was my 100th read, was Flux by Orion Carloto, and this is a poetry collection that Orion put out, and it is talking about her, I think her first like real heartbreak, and it just explores how all-consuming her first love was and how devastating her breakup was. And while I didn't really connect with that aspect, I thought her writing was really beautiful, and it was just a very beautifully written poetry collection to get through. And while I didn't necessarily relate to it, I could still appreciate her very nice writing. So yes, I read Flux finally, because that's been on my TBR forever. My 101 read is Are You Listening? And this is about a girl named Bia who is on the run from her family, and she meets up with Lou, who is, I think, a family friend, and they decide to take a road trip together to just get away from the town that they live in and to get away from their problems for a while. And it just explores their very different lives and how they cope with the things that they have gone through throughout their life, and it is so so beautifully illustrated. The art style and just like the color palette with the blues and pinks and oranges are so beautiful. It feels like you're just looking at a sunset for this entire graphic novel. It was very pretty, but I do have to admit that the story didn't really engage me as much as other graphic novels did, and it was just a very nice graphic novel to read to pass the time. I read 101 books in 2019, and I don't think that will ever happen ever again, because I read a lot of books that I was just okay with, and I should have DNF'd far sooner rather than finishing them and giving them 1 star. And I think in 2020 I am mostly going to focus on quality rather than quantity. So I'm going to be reading far less books in 2020, but that's not to say that I'm not going to be doing these recent reads, because I really enjoy them, and I feel like a bunch of you also really enjoy watching them and hearing my thoughts about the books that I have recently read. So thank you so much for sticking around with my recent reads. We finally finished it. We got to 100 books. Now we have 10 episodes of recent reads that you can watch. If you have not watched any of the previous ones, I will link the playlist down below. If you want to follow me on Instagram, that is where I post my current reads nearly every single day, so you could get updated on what I'm currently reading. Or if you just want to follow me there, be sure to do so. The link will be down below. And thank you so much for watching. If you have not subscribed already, be sure to do so as well, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!